They fired me a week before my pension vested. 28 years at a single company gives you certain habits. You park in the same spot. You eat the same lunch on Fridays. You learn which fluorescent tube on the third floor flickers when the wind is bad. And, if you have any sense at all, you learn which decisions the company makes for reasons it tells you, and which decisions it makes for reasons it does not. The morning HR called me into the small conference room, the one without windows. I was 8 days short of my 20th anniversary. I had not noticed the date. It would turn out, later, that this was the only thing about that morning I had not noticed. The company made hydraulic systems. Big ones. The kind that go into the lift mechanisms of cranes, the steering of mining trucks, the actuation of agricultural equipment too heavy for 2 men to carry. We had 3 plants in Ohio and 1 outside Cincinnati that did the precision machine parts. I had walked into the main plant on a Tuesday morning in June 1997 as a 23-year-old kid with a freshly printed mechanical engineering degree from Akron and a strong hunch that I was going to hate it. I did not hate it. I loved it. There is a particular satisfaction in working at a company that makes something, a thing you can stand next to and weigh and touch, that I have never found anywhere else, and I have looked. I started in the design office, drafting hydraulic schematics for the smaller agricultural systems. After 3 years, they moved me to the controls group. After 5 years, I was running the controls group. By year 10, I was the company's de facto in-house software architect, because the systems we shipped had grown enough firmware in them that someone had to be responsible for it. And I was the only person in the building who'd taken a single computer science class on top of his engineering degree. The other thing I did, in 2008, when the financial crisis hit and the company went through the first of 3 rounds of redundancies that would eventually thin our workforce by 40%, was write the Severance compliance software. I want you to remember that. It will matter later. The system was simple in its bones. Every salaried employee had a record in our HR database that listed their hire date, their pension election, their job grade, their salary band, and a flag, a single Boolean field, that determined whether they were eligible for the company's old defined benefit pension scheme or the newer defined contribution scheme they'd switched everyone to in the late 90s. The DB scheme had a vesting cliff at 28 years. Before 28 years of service, you walked away with your contributions and a small interest factor. At 28 years and 1 day, you walked away with the full pension, about $1.25 million in present value for someone at my pay grade. The DC scheme had no such cliff. You vested gradually. Most employees were on the DC scheme. Only employees hired before 1998, about 300 of us, when I built the system, were still on the old DB. The compliance software did one thing. When HR was preparing a redundancy package for a salaried employee, it cross-checked the proposed package against 3 rules. 1. The package could not be structured in a way that would push the employee below the minimum legal severance for their tenure. 2. The package could not exclude any benefits the employee was contractually entitled to as of the proposed termination date. 3. And this is the rule I built last, on the advice of an outside counsel the CEO at the time had retained. The package could not be timed in a way that would deprive a DB pension employee of vesting if the employee's vesting date fell within 90 days of the proposed termination. Rule 3 was a defensive rule. It was specifically designed to prevent the company being sued for age discriminatory and pension stripping redundancies. I wrote it. I tested it. I deployed it. I documented it in a 30-page internal memo that, to my knowledge, was read by exactly 4 people: the CEO, the general counsel, the head of HR, and the controller. 2 of those 4 people were no longer at the company by 2024. The new CEO was the 3rd I had worked under. He had arrived in late 2023 from a private equity-backed industrial conglomerate where he had a reputation, fairly earned, for cutting his way to margin within 18 months of arrival. The board had hired him exactly for that reputation. By spring 2025, the workforce restructuring was in full motion. We had lost 200 people in the first round, mostly from the assembly floor and the warehouse. The second round, in early summer, was supposed to take another 80 from the engineering and management ranks. Everyone in my building knew it was coming. We talked about it the way people in the Midwest talk about weather, as something that would arrive on its own schedule, that you couldn't argue with. The HR letter came on a Thursday. I was asked to attend a meeting on the Monday following. The meeting was at 9 in the morning. I was offered a chair, a glass of water, and the news that my role had been reorganized out of existence, and that I was being offered a redundancy package. The package was generous, on its surface. 6 months of salary, continuation of benefits, prorated bonus, a sealed reference, outplacement services. The head of HR, a woman who had been at the company 18 months and whom I did not particularly know, said the words, "Given your long service," twice. She handed me the agreement to sign. The proposed termination date was Friday, 5 days away. My 20th anniversary was the Friday after that. 12 days, total, from the moment I sat down in that chair to the moment my pension would have vested. I asked for a copy of the agreement to review with counsel. She seemed surprised that I would not sign on the spot. She said, "Of course." Her tone said, "They never asked for that." I went back to my desk. I did not pack any boxes. I did not tell the controls group what had just happened, although they could see from my face that something had. I sat at my desk for the remaining 6 hours of the workday, working on a hydraulic torque calibration for an agricultural client in Iowa that, in retrospect, did not need finishing. At 5 o'clock, I left the building. I drove to a diner I had been to once before, for years earlier, in a different town, for a different reason. I ordered black coffee. I sat in a booth at the back and read the agreement, slowly, twice. It was not until the second reading that I noticed the date on the proposed termination clause was 8 days short of my pension vesting. I drove home. I went into the small home office I kept above the garage. I opened a laptop I had not used for work in 11 years. On that laptop, in a folder labeled Compliance, 2008, was the original source code for the Severance compliance software. The version I had written. The version that included Rule 3. I had not stolen it. I had backed it up at the time, with the full knowledge of the General Counsel, because she had wanted a copy outside the building's own server in case of a fire or a system failure. She had emailed me to ask for the backup. The email was still in my personal account. I sat with the laptop open on the desk for about 20 minutes, not doing anything. Then I went downstairs to the kitchen, made another cup of coffee, came back up, sat down, and opened the source code. It was exactly as I'd left it. I diffed it against the system the company was running today. Rule 3 had been removed. Quietly. About 2 months earlier. By a contractor I had never met, brought in to modernize the HR stack. The removal was logged. It was documented in a commit message that said, in its entirety, refactored vesting check, legacy rule retired per HR advice. I did not call a lawyer that night. I did not call my wife, who was already aware that something was wrong, but who had the wisdom to give me an evening alone in the office above the garage. What I did was make a list. The list had 3 columns. In the first column, I wrote down the names of every salaried employee at the company who, to my knowledge, was currently within 24 months of their pension vesting date. There were 11 names on that list when I started. By the end of the evening, after consulting some old org charts I still had on the laptop, there were 16. In the second column I wrote, next to each name, my best guess as to whether they had been let go in the recent restructuring rounds. 11 of the 16 had been. In the third column I wrote, next to each of those 11, what I could remember of their termination dates. Every single one was less than 90 days before their pension would have vested. I went downstairs. I told my wife what I had found. I told her I was going to take the next morning off work. She did not ask why. I did not go in on Tuesday. I did not go in on Wednesday either. I did not call HR or my supervisor. I did, instead, call a lawyer, but not the lawyer the company would have expected me to call, the local employment specialist whose name was on the redundancy paperwork as a recommended outplacement contact. I called a different lawyer, in a different city, whose name I'd kept in my phone for 15 years for reasons that had once seemed paranoid and now seemed prescient. She listened for 40 minutes. She asked 3 questions. Then she told me to come to her office on Friday morning, to bring the laptop, and to not. under any circumstances, sign anything in the meantime. What followed was 6 months. I do not want to oversell the drama of those 6 months because most of them were spent doing things that, on the surface, were boring. The lawyer, whose name was Alma, did the things that good lawyers do. She filed a request under our state's open records equivalent, a state law that requires private employers above a certain size to retain certain records for certain durations. She sent a polite letter to the company's general counsel, a different person, by now, than the one I had originally worked with, informing them that I had not signed the agreement and that I had retained counsel. I, meanwhile, did not work. The company's letter had carefully not included a non-compete or a confidentiality clause because the original general counsel had, on my advice, 12 years earlier, established a policy that the company would not use those clauses in routine redundancy packages on the grounds that they were unenforceable in our state and made the company look paranoid. So I had time. I used it. I tracked down 9 of the 11 former employees on my list. 6 of them were retired and not interested in further conflict. 2 of them had moved out of state. One of them, a woman named Lillian who had worked in the cost accounting group for 31 years, was, like me, 8 days short of her vesting date when she had been let go in the previous round. Lillian had assumed, when it happened to her, that it was a coincidence. The 4 of us, me, Lillian, and 2 others Alma found through quiet inquiries, became the named plaintiffs. The complaint was filed in federal court in early November. It alleged that the company had, through a deliberate alteration of its own compliance software and through a pattern of carefully timed terminations, engaged in an unlawful scheme to avoid vesting 11 defined benefit pensions. The total dollar value of the 11 pensions, in present value, was a little over $13 million. The complaint named, as Exhibit A, the original source code of Rule 3. As Exhibit B, the diff showing its removal. As Exhibit C, the contractor's commit message. As Exhibit D, the 11 termination dates. The complaint did not name me as the original author of the compliance software because Alma had advised that this was a fact better surfaced in cross-examination than in the pleading. But the company's general counsel, a man I had never met, who had been brought in by the new CEO from his previous firm, read the complaint at his desk on a Wednesday afternoon, and at 3 o'clock that afternoon his assistant called the new CEO's office, and at 4 o'clock the CEO called the chairman of the board. The settlement conference was set for the following Monday. We settled. The terms are confidential, and I will not break them here. What I will say is that the 11 affected employees and their families are well provided for. What I will also say is that the new CEO is no longer the CEO. The chairman of the board is no longer the chairman of the board. The contractor who quietly removed Rule 3 has, I'm told, found other work. The company is still making hydraulic systems. The plant outside Cincinnati is still making the precision machine parts. Most of the people I worked with for 28 years are still there. I am not. I am in my home office, above the garage, writing this. I am asked, sometimes, by friends who know what happened, whether I would do it again. The question is meant to test whether I have any regret, whether the months of legal work and the loss of the daily rhythm of a place I loved was worth the outcome. I do not regret it. I will tell you why. When I built Rule 3 in 2008, I built it for an old general counsel who is now dead. She and I had a conversation on a Thursday evening that ran past 9 o'clock about why the rule was needed. She said something I have not forgotten in 17 years. She said, "The company is a creature that will, given the chance, save itself at the expense of its oldest employees. The compliance software is the only thing that prevents that. So the compliance software must be kept honest. I built the software to keep the company honest." In 2025, someone removed Rule 3 because the company had grown tired of being kept honest. I had 2 choices. I could sign the agreement and walk away with 6 months' salary and my dignity broadly intact. Or I could remember the conversation in 2008 and do what the woman who taught me how to think about that company would have done. She would have filed the lawsuit. I filed the lawsuit on her behalf as much as on mine. That is the part of this story I want to end on. Not the settlement. Not the CEO. not the chairman. The part where a piece of code I had written 17 years earlier, which was supposed to protect people I would never meet, did exactly what it had been designed to do, even after the company had tried to delete it. Some things, once built well, you cannot undo.